what Eisenhower's reaction was when Patton captured impenetrable Metz in 8 days. September 27, 1944. 5:43 a.m. Fort Drian, Metz, France. Private James Holloway pressed his back against a stone wall, slick with blood and rain. 20 feet ahead, a German machine gun nest was tearing his platoon apart in real time. He watched Corporal Danny Reeves catch 3 rounds in the chest and spin backward like a rag doll into the mud. He watched Lieutenant Morrison try to throw a grenade and lose his arm at the elbow before the pin was even pulled. He watched 47 men reduced to 9 in less than 4 minutes. Holloway was a welder from Akron, Ohio. He fixed factory equipment for a living. He had never been trained for this. Nobody had been trained for this, because nobody believed an American infantry division would ever be ordered to storm a fortress that had not fallen in over 1,000 years of continuous military history. But George Patton believed, and that belief was getting men killed by the hundreds. What happened next over the following 8 weeks would change the entire doctrine of modern warfare. It would turn a catastrophic failure into history's most stunning reversal. It would force the most decorated general in Europe to do something he had never done in his entire career: admit he was wrong, and then come back and prove why being wrong was the greatest thing that ever happened to him. November 8, 1944, 4:17 a.m. Third Army Forward Command Post, Nancy, France. The coffee in Lieutenant General George S. Patton's tin cup had gone cold 2 hours ago. He hadn't touched it. He was standing over a map table that took up most of the room, his famous ivory-handled revolvers gleaming at his hips, his face carved from something harder than stone. Around him, his staff officers stood in a careful perimeter, the way men stand around a fire they are not entirely sure they can control. Nobody spoke unless spoken to. Not tonight. Tonight was different. Tonight, Patton was counting his dead. The September assault on Fort Drian had cost Third Army 1,500 casualties in 9 days of fighting. 9 days of sending American boys into walls 12 feet thick, while German defenders inside laughed at the artillery shells bouncing off reinforced concrete. 9 days of watching brilliant tactics evaporate against fortifications that had been engineered specifically to defeat brilliant tactics. 9 days that ended in the most humiliating order Patton had ever given in his 30-year military career: withdrawal. Pull back. Walk away from an objective he had publicly promised to take in 3 days. For most generals, this would have been a footnote, a tactical setback in a war full of tactical setbacks. For Patton, it was an open wound that refused to close. To understand why Metz mattered so much, you need to understand what Metz actually was, not just strategically, physically, historically, psychologically. Because by the autumn of 1944, the city of Metz in northeastern France was not simply a city. It was an idea. The idea that some things cannot be taken by force, that some defenses are absolute, that some walls, literally and figuratively, cannot be broken. The Romans built the first fortifications at Metz before the birth of Christ. Attila the Hun tried to take it in 451 AD and failed. Charlemagne used it as a base because he knew he could not afford to fight it. The Holy Roman Empire turned it into the beating heart of its eastern defenses. When the Prussians finally captured Metz from the French in 1870, it took them 54 days, 100,000 soldiers, and casualties that shocked the entire civilized world. And that was against a 19th century garrison with 19th century weapons. By 1944, the Germans had spent 4 years adding every modern fortification technology available to a defensive network that already included 43 separate forts, underground tunnel systems connecting them, ammunition depots buried 60 feet below ground level, hospitals, command centers, and firing positions specifically engineered to cover every possible approach route. The Wehrmacht garrison inside numbered somewhere between 15 and 20,000 men. They had supplies for months. They had overlapping fields of fire. They had artillery pre-sighted on every road, every field, every natural choke point within 5 miles of the city perimeter. German military planners called Metz the most impregnable defensive position in Western Europe. They were not bragging. They were stating a fact backed by 1,000 years of empirical evidence. And George Patton had told Eisenhower he would take it in 10 days. When Third Army was stopped cold at Fort Driant in September, the ripple effects were immediate and brutal. SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, began quietly revising its operational timelines. Intelligence analysts started writing assessments that concluded Metz would require a months-long siege operation. Omar Bradley, Patton's immediate superior, began allocating additional resources to other sectors because the arithmetic of Metz was simply not adding up in anyone's favor. The broader strategic picture was already under enormous pressure. The Allied advance across France that had seemed unstoppable after the breakout at Saint-Lô was running into the hard reality of extended supply lines, worsening weather, and an enemy that was no longer retreating, but digging in. The Siegfried Line waited beyond Metz. The Rhine waited beyond that. Winter was coming. Time was the one resource no one had enough of, and at Metz, time was bleeding out one failed assault at a time. Patton knew all of this. He knew it in the way commanders know things that they are not allowed to say out loud in front of their staff. He knew that if Metz did not fall before winter locked down the front, the entire timetable for crossing into Germany would shift by months. He knew that those months had a price measured in lives and in the larger mathematics of a war still far from over. And he knew something else. Something he had not yet admitted to anyone, including himself. That the tactics he had used at Fort Driant in September were wrong. Not just wrong for that specific situation. Wrong at a fundamental level. Wrong in a way that revealed a gap in his thinking that he had been able to ignore for 2 years of mobile warfare across North Africa, Sicily, and France. Speed works when your enemy cannot prepare. Aggression works when the terrain gives you room to maneuver. Shock works when the defender has somewhere to retreat to. But Fort Driant had no retreat. Fort Driant had walls that absorbed shock the way the ocean absorbs stones. Fort Driant required something Patton had never needed before. Something that went against every instinct that had made him the most feared offensive general in the Allied armies. Fort Driant required patience. It required study. It required the willingness to stop, acknowledge failure, and rebuild from the ground up. For George Patton, this was not a tactical problem. It was a philosophical crisis. The man who emerged from that crisis was someone his own staff barely recognized. 2 days after ordering the withdrawal from Fort Driant, Patton called a meeting that would later be described by Colonel Halim Maddox as the most unusual gathering he had ever attended in 20 years of military service. No maps on the table. No operational objectives on the agenda. Just Patton, his senior officers, and a single question written in large letters on a chalkboard at the front of the room. What did we get wrong? For 3 hours, Patton did something he had never done in the presence of his subordinates. He listened. He called in every survivor he could find from the September assault, from privates all the way to colonels, and he asked them the same questions in the same order. What did you see when you approached the fort? What worked? What failed? What would you do differently if you went back? He took notes himself rather than having an aide do it. He interrupted only to ask follow-up questions. He argued with nobody. He corrected nobody. He simply absorbed. When a young sergeant from the 11th Infantry Regiment described watching 3 artillery barrages bounce harmlessly off Fort Drion's outer walls, while the Germans simply waited inside, Patton made a note without expression. When a combat engineer explained that the standard breach equipment issued to assault teams was designed for wooden and brick construction and was essentially useless against reinforced concrete of the type used in German fortifications, Patton made another note. When a company commander described how German defenders had pre-sighted their machine guns on the only approach routes that didn't cross open ground, making every concealed advance path a killing ground, Patton stopped, asked the man to repeat himself, and made the longest note of the entire session. After the meeting, Patton sent for the French military archives relating to the 1870 Prussian siege of Metz. He read the German accounts of their own tactics. He requested intelligence assessments of every fort in the Metz defensive network, cross-referenced with construction records the OSS had obtained from captured German engineering documents. He brought in specialist engineers who had studied European fortification design and made them brief him for 6 hours straight on the structural vulnerabilities, if any, of 19th century forts, modified with 20th century materials. He was building something, not a plan, not yet. First, he was building understanding. Because he had learned, in the most expensive classroom available, that attacking without understanding is not aggression. It is waste. What he discovered changed everything. The forts at Metz had been designed on the assumption that attacking forces would follow standard military doctrine: mass artillery preparation, infantry assault on primary approach routes, exploitation of any breach achieved. The entire defensive architecture was optimized to defeat exactly this kind of attack. The walls were positioned to deflect artillery rounds, rather than absorb them directly. The embrasures, the firing slits in the walls, were angled to cover the obvious approach routes, while remaining almost invisible from the angles any attacking force would naturally occupy. The tunnels connecting the forts allowed defenders to reinforce any threatened section faster than attacking infantry could exploit a temporary advantage. The whole system was brilliant, layered, and fundamentally oriented toward making conventional assault as costly as possible. But it had assumptions built into it, and assumptions are vulnerabilities. The fortifications assumed attackers would approach from predictable angles because those were the angles with the best cover and concealment. Change the angle of approach, expose your men to more initial fire, but suddenly the embrasures are no longer covering you. The walls assumed artillery would be aimed at them directly, because that was standard suppression doctrine. Shift to direct fire from tank destroyers at oblique angles, and you could exploit microfractures in the 19th century stonework that no 20th century modification had addressed. The defenders assumed assault teams would be equipped with standard breach equipment, because that was what the doctrinal manuals specified. Bring specialized engineer teams with Bangalore torpedoes and pole charges specifically designed for reinforced concrete, and suddenly the walls became a problem with a solution rather than a wall without one. And the entire system assumed that attacking forces would prioritize reaching the walls fastest, using smoke and speed to minimize exposure time. Reverse that priority. Use smoke not to conceal movement toward the walls, but to blind the defenders from the moment the assault began, and you convert the fort's greatest strength, overlapping fields of fire, into a liability. Because overlapping fields of fire are useless if the defenders cannot see. Patton called this new tactical framework systematic reduction. His staff called it the most thorough operational rethinking they had ever witnessed from any commander at any level. The training that followed was unlike anything Third Army had done before. Every assault unit ran the new approach dozens of times on mock fortifications, constructed by Third Army engineers to the specifications of actual Metz forts. Every combat engineer team drilled specifically on concrete breach techniques until the timing was automatic. Every artillery and tank destroyer crew practiced the oblique fire angles until accuracy became muscle memory. Every company commander memorized the approach routes that exploited the dead ground, the blind spots, the angles that Fort Drion's builders had never accounted for, because no attacker had ever been patient enough to find them. 2 months of preparation. 2 months of controlled, methodical, unglamorous work by an army that everyone at SHAEF was quietly assuming had already shot its best opportunity at Metz and failed. On November 8, 1944, George S. Patton launched the second assault on Metz. Not with the thunder and fury that had characterized Third Army's advance across France. Not with the improvised brilliance that had made him famous. With precision, with patience, with an army that had learned from its failures and rebuilt itself around those lessons into something the German garrison inside those ancient walls had no existing doctrine to counter. The results were immediate and staggering. Fort Drion, the fortress that had stopped Third Army cold in September and held for 2 weeks before Patton was forced to withdraw, fell in 6 hours. 6 hours. The same walls, the same German defenders, the same artillery, but different angles, different equipment, different timing, different thinking. The fort that had been a monument to American failure in September became a monument to American adaptation in November. And it was only the first. By the end of the first day of the new assault, 3 major fortifications in the Metz defensive ring had fallen. Casualties were a fraction of September's totals. The German garrison, which had spent 4 years preparing for exactly the kind of assault they had already successfully repelled, was now facing something they had no answer for. Not overwhelming force, not sustained bombardment. Methodical, intelligent, adaptive combat by an army that had done something no force in the previous 1,000 years of Metz's history had ever done. It had studied its own failure honestly, rebuilt its approach completely, and come back with weapons that the ancient walls had never been built to stop. Back in Versailles, Eisenhower received the first reports from the new Metz assault, with the careful expression of a man who has learned not to let his hopes outrun his information. He read the casualty figures twice. He asked Bradley to confirm them. He walked to his wall map and stood in front of that bold red word for a long moment. Then he picked up the telephone. What he heard next stopped him cold. Because in Nancy, France, George Patton was not watching his army fight. He was watching his army learn in real time. And somewhere in the chaos and smoke and falling stone of Metz's ancient fortifications, a new kind of warfare was being born from the wreckage of the old one. The question was whether it would be enough, because Patton had promised 10 days. And somewhere in the German High Command, a decision was being made that nobody in Third Army knew about yet. A decision that would turn the next 72 hours into the most dangerous period of the entire operation. A decision that threatened to undo everything Patton had built in 2 months of patient preparation. In Part 2, we will see what the Germans were planning inside those walls, why Patton's greatest test was not the fortifications themselves, but what was waiting behind them, and the moment one ordinary soldier from a small town in Pennsylvania made a decision that changed the course of the entire battle. 3 forts down, 6 hours. The German garrison at Metz was bleeding for the first time in the 1,000 years. George Patton's new tactics had done in 1 morning what 2 weeks of brutal fighting in September had failed to accomplish. But here is what nobody at Third Army headquarters knew at 6 a.m. on November 9, 1944. Inside those ancient walls, a German general named Heinrich Kittel had just made a decision that would transform the next 8 days into something far more dangerous than anyone had planned for. And back in Versailles, another battle was already underway. Not against fortifications, against the men who controlled the resources Patton needed to finish what he had started. Because 40 forts still stood, and the mathematics of what it would take to reduce them one by one were making very powerful people very nervous about a timeline that seemed, to everyone except George Patton, completely insane. November 9th, 1944, 9:30 a.m., Schaeff Logistics Command, Versailles. Major General Raymond Moses did not raise his voice. That was the thing about Moses that made him genuinely dangerous in a conference room. He delivered bad news with the calm precision of a surgeon describing a terminal diagnosis. And he had been delivering bad news to Patton's operations requests since North Africa. He sat at the head of the table with a single sheet of paper in front of him and looked at Colonel Maddox the way a man looks at someone who has just asked him to move a mountain by Thursday. The request on the table was straightforward. Third Army needed an additional allocation of combat engineer personnel, specialized concrete breach equipment, and tank destroyer ammunition above its current supply ceiling. The numbers were specific: 12 additional engineer companies, 400 Bangalore torpedo assemblies rated for reinforced concrete, 70,000 rounds of 90mm direct-fire ammunition. Maddox had brought the request personally because Patton had told him that anything less than a personal delivery would guarantee a 2-week delay, and they did not have 2 weeks. Moses looked at the request for a long moment. Then he looked at Maddox. Third Army is already drawing at 112% of its authorized supply ceiling. Every resource you're asking for comes directly out of allocations currently assigned to 1st Army and 9th Army sectors. He set the paper down. General Hodges is preparing for operations that cannot be delayed. General Simpson has a timeline that does not accommodate reallocation. I cannot strip 2 Army sectors to support a 10-day timeline that the entire intelligence community has assessed as operationally unrealistic. He paused. You can tell General Patton that his September casualty figures are the reason we cannot give him what he is asking for now. He spent the resource credit in September. There is nothing left. Maddox had been told by Patton, in explicit terms, exactly what to say next. He said it. Sir, if Third Army does not receive these allocations within 48 hours, the assault on Metz will slow. If the assault slows, the German garrison has time to reorganize around the new tactical approach. If they reorganize, we lose the momentum advantage, and this becomes a siege operation lasting months, not days. The supply cost of a months-long siege at Metz is approximately 40 times the cost of what we are requesting right now. Moses was quiet for a moment. That is a compelling argument, Colonel. Unfortunately, I do not make resource allocation decisions based on compelling arguments from officers representing a general who has already exceeded his authorized ceiling by 12%. He stood. Request denied. You may appeal to General Smith. What Moses did not know, because Patton had been very careful about the timing of this information, was that the appeal to General Smith was already in progress, and that the man delivering it was not a staff officer. It was Omar Bradley himself. Bradley had been watching the first reports from the November 8th assault with the careful attention of a commander who has learned to read early data without overcommitting to its implications. What he saw made him pick up the telephone, not because the tactical results were good, though they were extraordinary, because the casualty figures were a fraction of September's number. In modern warfare, the thing that moves logistics committees faster than any tactical argument is a casualty ratio that makes the requested resources look cheap. Bradley called Smith at 8:15 a.m. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. By 9:45 a.m., Moses received a directive from Schaeff that superseded his denial. The allocations were approved. Maddox was back in his car with the authorization paperwork by 10 a.m. and driving east toward Nancy at a speed that suggested Patton had communicated his timeline expectations very clearly. The resources arrived at Third Army forward depots on November 10th. What happened next was not a military operation in the conventional sense. It was a production line. Patton had divided his assault forces into sequential reduction teams, each one assigned to a specific fort in the Metz defensive ring. Each one trained for the specific characteristics of its target, based on the intelligence gathered over 2 months of preparation. As the first teams completed their objectives and rotated back, they immediately became trainers for the follow-on teams, passing forward the real-time lessons from the actual assault, rather than from the rehearsal models. This created a learning acceleration that no doctrine manual had ever described, because no doctrine manual had ever been written by someone who had failed at Metz and survived to rebuild. The knowledge moved faster than the ammunition. November 11th, 1944, 3 p.m. Fort Caillou Assault Line, Eastern Metz Perimeter. Sergeant First Class Walter Briggs from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, had been a mechanic before the war. He fixed engines. He understood systems. He understood that any system, no matter how well designed, has a failure point if you apply the right force in the right place at the right time. He had been listening to the debriefs from Fort Drian with the attention of a man who recognizes his own expertise in someone else's problem. When his company commander asked for volunteers to lead the breach team on Fort Cailou's eastern wall, Briggs raised his hand before the question was finished. His plan was not in any manual. He had drawn it on the back of a ration wrapper, using information from the engineering briefings and his own 20 years of understanding how metal and concrete behave under stress. The German modifications to Fort Cailou's 19th century walls had used a specific grade of reinforced concrete that, according to the captured engineering documents, had been poured in sections rather than continuously. Section joints were the weakest point in any poured concrete structure. If you could identify the joint locations from the exterior surface patterns and concentrate your breach charges on the joints rather than on the solid face, you could breach a 12-foot wall with roughly 1/3 of the explosive material that a frontal approach required, which meant faster placement, which meant less exposure time for the breach team, which meant the thing that cost the most in September, time on the ground in front of a defended position, was dramatically reduced. Briggs had identified 4 section joints on Fort Cailou's eastern wall from reconnaissance photographs. He marked them on his wrapper. He calculated charge placement and timing. He briefed his team for 40 minutes using a model made from mud and sticks. Then he looked at his 6 men and said, "We're going to be on that wall for 90 seconds. We place the charges on my marks. We move to the defilade position. We wait for the engineer's signal. And then the infantry goes through the hole." One of his men asked what happened if the hole wasn't big enough. Briggs said, "Then I miscalculated and we do it again." He said it without any drama. He was a mechanic. You fix things until they work. The assault on Fort Caillou began at 3:47 p.m. Artillery suppression on a 3-minute schedule. Smoke deployment covering a 200-meter front. Tank destroyers at oblique angles, firing through the embrasures, keeping the German defenders' heads down with a precision that September's crews could not have managed. Briggs' breach team moved under the smoke to the eastern wall in 83 seconds. He placed charges on all 4 section joints in 61 seconds. His team reached the defilade position and signaled. The charges detonated. The wall did not explode outward, the way a demolition charge on open stone does. It fractured along the joints in a controlled collapse that opened a gap 4 meters wide and nearly 3 meters high. Briggs stood up, looked at the gap, and said 2 words to his radio operator. "Infantry up." Fort Caillou fell in 4 hours and 12 minutes. German casualties inside the fort were significant. American casualties in the assault team were 2 wounded, neither critically. The September approach to a comparable fortification had taken 9 days and cost over 200 casualties before Patton ordered withdrawal. The ratio was not an improvement, it was a transformation. When Patton received the report at his command post in Nancy, he read the casualty figures first, as he always did. Then he read the breach timeline. Then he read it again. He said nothing for approximately 30 seconds. Then he turned to Maddox and said, "Get Briggs's name in the operational report. Full details of the technique. Every assault team on the line gets this information by 0600 tomorrow." He paused. "And note that a mechanic from Pennsylvania just invented a better way to fight." Maddox wrote it down. By November 14th, Third Army had reduced 11 of Metz's 43 fortifications. The German garrison was still holding the city center and the largest remaining forts. But the defensive architecture that had been designed as an interconnected system was being dismantled piece by piece. Each fort that fell removed fire support from its neighbors. Each gap in the defensive ring made the remaining positions more isolated, more vulnerable, more dependent on defenders who were running out of the one resource that even the most fortified position cannot manufacture: hope. Inside the city, General Kittel was sending reports to Army Group G that bore no relationship to the confident assessments his command had been filing in September. The Americans were not attacking the way Germans expected Americans to attack. They were not being stopped by the measures that had been specifically prepared to stop them. Something had changed. Something fundamental. And the garrison, which had been told by Berlin to hold Metz to the last man, was discovering that the instructions had not included a contingency for an enemy that had learned how to make last men irrelevant. On November 15th, a German signals intercept, decoded by Third Army intelligence, revealed something that made Patton's operations officer go very still before picking up the telephone. Kittel had requested permission from Army Group G to begin destroying the city's infrastructure. Bridges, rail junctions, the ancient cathedral, the supply depots that Third Army needed intact if Metz was going to function as a logistics hub for the drive toward the Siegfried Line. Permission had not yet been granted, but the request had been made, and if Berlin said yes, everything Patton was building toward became exponentially more complicated. Because taking a city in 8 days was one thing. Taking a city in 8 days, while stopping a garrison from burning it to the ground, was something else entirely. Something that no amount of tactical preparation at Fort Driant had accounted for. And 300 miles to the east, in a headquarters bunker that Third Army intelligence had not yet located, someone was already drafting the authorization that Kittel was waiting for. The war Patton had planned for was about to become a different war entirely. 11 forts down. 14 days of preparation compressed into 6 days of systematic destruction. Sergeant Briggs's concrete breach technique had spread through every assault team on the Metz perimeter faster than any official training program could have managed. Because soldiers teach each other things that save lives with an urgency that no manual can replicate. But on November 15th, Third Army intelligence decoded a German signals intercept that changed the entire character of the operation. General Kittel had requested authorization to begin destroying Metz's infrastructure. Bridges, rail junctions, supply depots, the city itself. Berlin had not yet responded, but the request was sitting on a desk somewhere east of the Rhine, and every hour it sat there was an hour closer to an answer that would transform Patton's 8-day race into something with a completely different set of consequences. 48 hours later, the German response arrived, and it was not the one anyone expected. November 16, 1944, 11 p.m. Army Group G Headquarters, Germany. General Hermann Balck read Kittle's situation reports with the expression of a man being told his house is on fire while standing inside it. The numbers were not possible. They were not consistent with any assessment his staff had prepared about American capabilities at Metz. Fort Drian, the cornerstone of the entire defensive network, had fallen in 6 hours. Fort Culla in 4. 7 additional fortifications in the following 5 days at casualty ratios that looked like transcription errors until his intelligence officer confirmed them 3 separate times. American casualties across 11 fort reductions totaled less than what the garrison had inflicted in 2 days of September fighting. Something had fundamentally changed in how Third Army was fighting, and Balck's intelligence staff had spent 48 hours trying to determine exactly what. The answer came from a captured American engineer who had been taken during a patrol action on the northern perimeter. Under interrogation, he described the breach technique in enough detail for Balck's engineers to understand what they were dealing with. Section joint targeting, oblique direct fire suppression, coordinated smoke deployment timed to the breach sequence rather than to the infantry approach. Each element was individually familiar. Combined in this specific sequence with this specific timing, it neutralized every defensive advantage the Metz fortifications had been designed to provide. Balck's chief engineer told him flatly that there was no countermeasure available within the garrison's current resources that would restore the defensive equations to their September parameters. The Americans had not found a weakness in the forts. They had found a weakness in the doctrine that built them. Those were not the same problem, and they did not have the same solution. Balck sent 2 responses. The first authorized Kittle to begin selective infrastructure destruction, prioritizing the rail junctions and the bridge over the Moselle at Pontefroy. The second was a detailed technical report transmitted to every German army group on the Western Front, describing the new American assault methodology and requesting immediate tactical review of all fortified defensive positions. Within 72 hours, the report had reached OKW headquarters. Within a week, it would be on Himmler's desk. The Germans were not going to solve the Metz problem, but they were going to make certain that whatever Patton had invented at Metz never surprised them the same way twice. That intelligence decision would shape the fighting along the Siegfried Line for the next 4 months. Back inside Metz, Kittle's demolition order created an immediate crisis that Patton's planning had not fully accounted for. The rail junction at Woipi in the city's northern district was critical to Third Army's logistics plan for the advance toward the Siegfried Line. If the Germans destroyed it before the garrison surrendered, rebuilding it to operational capacity would take 3 to 4 weeks and consume engineering resources currently allocated to bridge construction along the Rhine approach routes. Patton received the intelligence about the demolition authorization at 2 a.m. on November 17th. He stood in front of his map for 4 minutes without speaking. Then he turned to Maddox and gave an order that his operations staff would later describe as the moment the entire tactical plan changed shape. He pulled 2 assault teams off their assigned fort reduction objectives and redirected them to a different mission entirely. Not taking a fort, preventing a demolition. Getting American soldiers into the northern district of a still-defended city before a German engineer could connect a wire to a detonator. It was not in any plan. It had not been rehearsed. It required the assault teams to operate inside urban terrain, among civilian population, against defenders who were not confined to prepared fortifications, but distributed throughout a city grid. Everything that made the new breach tactics effective at fort walls was partially irrelevant in street fighting. Patton sent them anyway, because the alternative was watching 3 weeks of work evaporate into a logistics delay that cost more lives in the long run than the risk of 2 assault teams in a city at night. November 18th, 1944, 2:15 a.m., Northern Metz, Woipi District. Staff Sergeant Karl Novak from Cleveland had been a bus driver. He knew street grids. He knew how to navigate an unfamiliar city at speed without getting lost, because you develop that skill driving a bus route through road closures and detours in a city of 1 million people. His assault team of 14 men moved through the Woipi district using a sketch map drawn from a French civilian's description of the neighborhood. No reconnaissance photographs, no prior survey of the route. They moved in 2 elements, 4 men clearing ahead, 10 following with the specific mission of reaching the rail junction control building before the German demolition team that Kittel had dispatched 2 hours earlier. Novak did not know what a rail junction control building looked like from the outside. He had been told it was a brick structure approximately 40 meters from the main switching yard, and that it would have German military vehicles outside it. He found it by following the vehicles. It took 11 minutes from the point of entry into the district. The German demolition team had not yet completed their wiring. They were inside the building, 3 of them, armed with a sidearm between them because they were engineers, not infantry. And nobody had told them that American assault teams were operating in the Northern District at 2 a.m. Novak's element went through the door in 4 seconds. The Germans surrendered without firing a shot. The demolition charges were already placed on the primary switching equipment. They were not yet connected to a detonation circuit. Novak's team disconnected them, removed them from the building, and called in the all clear at 2:31 a.m. 16 minutes from district entry to mission complete. The Woipi rail junction survived intact. When Patton received the report at 3 a.m., he read it, set it down, and said to the duty officer, "Get me Novak's service record. I want his name on something official by morning." Then he went back to his map. Because the junction was saved, but the broader problem remained. 20 forts still stood in the Metz defensive ring. Kittel's demolition teams were still operational. And the clock that Patton had set for himself and announced to Eisenhower and Bradley and everyone at SHAEF who had been quietly skeptical, was now showing 7 days elapsed, with the city still not secured. The final phase began on November 19th, with a coordination that Patton's staff would later call the most complex single-day operation Third Army had executed since the breakout at Avranches. 6 simultaneous fort reductions across the eastern and southern perimeter, timed to begin within 30 minutes of each other, so that the German command center could not reinforce any single position without stripping another. Smoke deployment on a city-wide scale, covering every major road junction between the remaining forts, to prevent German infantry movement between positions. Tank destroyers firing at angles that had been calculated the previous evening, using the survey data from the 11 already reduced forts, because each fort that fell provided structural information about the ones still standing. The learning loop that Patton had built into his preparation was now feeding itself in real time. Every fort reduced made the next one faster. Fort Saint-Julien fell at 9:47 a.m. Fort Gambetta at 11:20 a.m. The 2 southern anchor positions, Fort Saint-Privat and Fort Culus Sud, fell within 40 minutes of each other at 2:15 and 2:54 p.m. By 5 p.m. on November 19th, the defensive ring that had protected Metz for 1,000 years had been reduced to 9 positions concentrated around the city center. Kittel pulled his remaining forces back into the old city and sent a final message to Army Group G. He was requesting terms of surrender authorization. He did not expect to receive them. He sent the message because the historical record required that he had asked. Berlin's response was exactly what he expected. Hold to the last man. He folded the message and put it in his coat pocket and began preparing for the last 3 days. The news from November 19th reached Eisenhower in Versailles at 7 p.m. Bradley called with the casualty figures first, as he always did when the news was good, because good casualty figures were the thing most likely to make Eisenhower approve the next operation without extensive qualification. 6 fort reductions in 1 day. Total American casualties across all 6 assaults combined. 41 wounded, 9 killed. Against fortifications that had been specifically engineered to produce American casualties in the hundreds per assault. Eisenhower sat with those numbers for a long moment. Then he asked Bradley to read them again. Bradley read them again. Eisenhower said nothing for 10 seconds. Then he said, "Omar, what we are watching Patton do at Metz is going to matter more to the Siegfried Line operation than anything we've done since Normandy." Bradley agreed. He had already ordered his staff to begin compiling Third Army's tactical reports for distribution to all Army commands. The doctrine being written in the rubble of Metz was going to be needed within weeks. By November 22nd, Third Army had reduced 38 of 43 fortifications. The 5 remaining positions were holding the city center around the ancient cathedral quarter, where Kittel had concentrated his remaining garrison of approximately 4,000 men. Patton made the decision that surprised his staff more than any order he had given in the entire operation. He stopped. He established a perimeter around the city center. He cut every supply and communication line. And he waited. Not because he lacked the capability to take the remaining positions. Because he had done the arithmetic. 5 fortifications in the cathedral district, surrounded, cut off, with no prospect of relief and no authorization to surrender. An assault would cost lives. A siege of 48 hours would cost nothing except time. And for the first time in his career, George Patton had enough patience to spend the time instead of the lives. General Kittel surrendered the Metz garrison at 2 p.m. on November 22, 1944. Total elapsed time from the commencement of the November assault, 14 days. Patton had promised 10. He had needed 14. He noted in his diary that the extra 4 days were the cost of the Woipi diversion, which had not been in his original estimate. He did not consider it a failure of the timeline. He considered it evidence that the methodology worked, even when applied to problems it had not been designed for. That flexibility was the point. That had always been the point. The final casualty comparison was the number that would appear in every tactical study of the Metz operation for the next 50 years. The September assault had produced 1,500 American casualties in 9 days, without capturing a single fort permanently. The November assault produced 640 casualties total across 14 days and reduced 43 fortifications, captured an entire garrison of between 15 and 20,000 men, and preserved the city's infrastructure almost entirely intact. The efficiency ratio was not an improvement on conventional siege warfare. It was a replacement for it. What Patton's army had demonstrated at Metz was that the age of the impregnable fortress was not merely challenged, it was over. Third Army began moving east within 48 hours of the garrison's surrender. The Siegfried Line waited. The Rhine waited. Berlin waited. But somewhere behind them, in the rubble of 43 forts that had stood for 1,000 years and fallen in 2 weeks, the lessons of Metz were already being transcribed, distributed, studied. The methodology that a welder's son from Ohio and a bus driver from Cleveland, and a mechanic from Pennsylvania had helped build out of failure and necessity, and 2 months of patient work, was becoming doctrine. Official. Permanent. Transformative. But here is what the operational reports did not record. What the tactical studies did not address. What the history books would largely overlook in favor of the strategic narrative. What happened to the men who built this? What Patton actually said to Eisenhower when the phones were not being monitored and the official communications were finished? What the general who had spent 2 months rebuilding himself from the ground up actually believed about what he had learned. That chapter of the Metz story has one more part, and it is the part that changes what the entire story means. From a catastrophic failure at Fort Driant in September 1944 to 43 fortifications reduced in 14 days, from 1,500 casualties in 9 days of failed assault to 640 casualties across an entire city captured. From an army that attacked harder to an army that learned smarter. George Patton had done what 1,000 years of military history said could not be done. And he had done it by doing the one thing his legend never prepared anyone to expect from him. He stopped. He listened. He rebuilt. But here is the question that the operational reports never answered and the tactical studies never addressed. What happened to the men who actually built this? What happened to Patton himself when the guns finally stopped? Because the story of Metz does not end with the garrison's surrender on November 22, 1944. It ends somewhere much quieter and much more important. And there is one final detail about this entire operation that almost nobody knows. A detail that reframes everything. George Patton did not live to see the full impact of what he created at Metz. He crossed the Rhine in March 1945. He reached Czechoslovakia before being ordered to halt, an order that infuriated him in ways he expressed in his diary with characteristic restraint. He attended the victory celebrations in May 1945 with the mixed satisfaction of a man who has finished a race and is already thinking about the next one. Then in December 1945, 7 months after the war ended, he was involved in a minor automobile accident near Mannheim, Germany. The injuries appeared manageable at first. They were not. General George S. Patton, Jr. died on December 21, 1945, from complications of a cervical spinal injury. He was 60 years old. He never returned to the United States. He is buried in Luxembourg at the American Military Cemetery at Ham, among the soldiers of Third Army, which is exactly where he would have chosen to be if anyone had asked him. Nobody asked him, because nobody expected him to need a grave so soon. The irony of Patton's death is the kind of irony that history produces with a cruelty that no novelist would dare to use. The man who survived North Africa, Sicily, the Normandy breakout, the Battle of the Bulge, the Rhine crossing, and the most systematically dangerous campaign of urban warfare the Western Front produced, was killed by a car accident on a peacetime road in a country he had helped defeat. His chief of staff, Bedell Smith, when told the news, reportedly sat without speaking for several minutes. Eisenhower, who was in Washington preparing for his transition to Army Chief of Staff, received the call and later wrote in his diary that he had lost the one commander whose presence made him simultaneously more confident and more anxious, which is perhaps the most accurate description of George Patton ever committed to paper. Walter Briggs, the mechanic from Harrisburg, whose section joint targeting technique had changed the entire character of the Metz assault, returned to Pennsylvania in the spring of 1946. He went back to working on engines. He did not talk about the war extensively. His neighbors knew he had served, They did not know what he had done. His service record noted the tactical contribution in language that was accurate and completely insufficient. He died in 1987 at the age of 71. His obituary in the local paper described him as a veteran and a mechanic. It did not mention Metz. It did not mention Fort Caillou. It did not mention the 16 minutes that saved a rail junction that supplied Third Army for the final push into Germany. That is not unusual. That is, in fact, the standard fate of the men whose names appear in operational reports rather than in newspapers. Carl Novak, the bus driver from Cleveland, who navigated the Wappie district by memory and secured the demolition site in 16 minutes, drove buses in Cleveland until 1971. He gave one interview about his wartime service to a local veterans organization newsletter in 1965, in which he described the Metz operation in 3 sentences and spent the remaining 800 words talking about the men in his team. He mentioned each of them by name. He did not mention himself at all. But here is what the men who came after them built on the foundation they laid at Metz. The tactical doctrine developed by Third Army during the November 1944 Metz operation was formally codified by the U.S. Army in a manual published in early 1945 under the title Urban Assault Against Fortified Positions. It was distributed to every Army command in the European theater before the final push into Germany. The techniques described in that manual: section joint targeting, oblique direct fire suppression, synchronized smoke deployment, engineer infantry integration at the assault team level, appeared in modified form in the operational planning for the reduction of German city defenses along the Siegfried Line, and in the urban fighting through the Rhine Industrial Corridor. Military historians have estimated that the casualty reduction achieved by applying Metz-derived tactics to subsequent fortified position assaults in the final 6 months of the European War saved between 8,000 and 12,000 American lives, compared to what the September-style assault methodology would have produced against the same objectives. 8,000 to 12,000 lives from one operation. From 2 months of a general sitting with failure instead of running from it. The influence did not stop in 1945. The urban warfare doctrine, developed at Metz, was studied by military establishments in 14 countries during the late 1940s and throughout the 1950s. The British Army incorporated modified versions of the breach sequencing techniques into their standard assault engineering curriculum. The Israeli Defense Forces, building their doctrine from the ground up in the late 1940s, drew specifically on the Metz operational reports when developing their approach to assaulting fortified Arab positions during the 1948 War of Independence. The IDF's emphasis on combined arms integration at the small unit level, which became one of their defining tactical characteristics across multiple conflicts, has direct doctrinal ancestry in what Third Army's engineers and infantry developed together in the rubble of Metz. The principle that Briggs applied intuitively: find the structural assumption behind the defense and attack that, rather than the defense itself, became a foundational concept in military engineering education that is still taught at West Point, Sandhurst, and the Israeli Staff College today. Not always with Metz cited as the origin, but the lineage is there for anyone who follows the citations. The civilian applications are less dramatic, but equally real. The controlled demolition techniques refined during the Metz operation, specifically the use of shaped charges placed at structural stress points rather than applied to surface faces, contributed directly to the post-war development of precision demolition engineering. The company that would eventually become one of the largest controlled demolition contractors in the United States was founded in 1947 by 2 Army engineers who had served in the European theater and applied what they had learned about concrete structure and explosive placement to the problem of taking down buildings efficiently and safely. They did not advertise the military origin of their techniques. The work spoke for itself. The deepest lesson of Metz, though, is not technical. It never was. Patton's achievement at Metz is taught in military academies as a case study in tactical adaptation. The lesson most commonly extracted is about the value of learning from failure, which is true and important, and also slightly incomplete. Because what Patton did at Metz was not simply learn from failure. Plenty of commanders experience failure and learn nothing from it, or learn the wrong things, or learn the right things too slowly. What Patton did was something more specific and more difficult. He created the conditions for learning. He built a structure, the post-September review, the survivor interviews, the technical analysis, the rebuilt training program, that allowed knowledge to flow from the people who had it, the soldiers who had been inside the failed assault, upward to the people who could act on it. He reversed the normal information hierarchy of a military command, at least temporarily, and the reversal produced the doctrine that saved the operation. That is not a tactical lesson. That is an organizational lesson. And it is one that applies with equal force to any institution trying to solve a problem that conventional approaches have already failed to solve. The institutions that defeated the most dangerous enemies of the 20th century were not the ones with the most rigid doctrines. They were the ones that could update their doctrines faster than their enemies could update their defenses. Metz is proof of that principle at a scale and speed that makes it almost impossible to argue with. 1,000 years of military history said those walls could not be taken in days. An army that spent 2 months honestly examining its own failure took them in 14. History has many examples of the same dynamic. The development of the proximity fuse by a team of physicists who had never designed weapons before. The invention of the jerry can by a German engineer whose solution was adopted wholesale by the Allies after they captured the design. The decision by a Navy commander named Admiral Mark Mitcher to turn on his carrier's lights to guide returning aircraft after the Battle of the Philippine Sea. A decision that violated every security protocol in existence and saved the lives of over 200 pilots. In each case, the breakthrough came from someone willing to prioritize the problem over the procedure. Someone willing to say that the existing approach was insufficient, and that being insufficient was not an acceptable outcome when lives were the currency being spent. And now the detail that almost nobody knows. In 2003, the U.S. Army's Combined Arms Center at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, was updating its historical case studies for the urban warfare curriculum, which had become urgently relevant following operations in Mogadishu and in anticipation of what was already being planned in Iraq. A researcher working through the original Third Army operational archives from November 1944 found something in Patton's personal diary that had not been included in any of the published biographies. An entry dated November 23, 1944, the day after the Metz garrison surrendered. Patton wrote about the operation in characteristically unsentimental terms, noting the casualty figures and the timeline, and his assessment of which tactical elements had been most decisive. Then, at the end of the entry, he wrote a single additional paragraph that his biographers had generally treated as a personal aside and not included in their narrative summaries. The paragraph read, in full, "The real victory at Metz was not the forts. Any army with enough ammunition and enough time can reduce a fort. The victory was that my men learned how to be wrong productively. I taught them that. Or rather, September taught them, and I had the sense to let them teach each other. I hope I remember this when we reach Berlin. I suspect I will forget it the moment someone tells me the Rhine can't be crossed in 3 days. I probably deserve whatever that costs me.